At 30, Zhang Yiden believes that most of her friends are having their second or even third child. But Zhang has more than a dozen of them. There's Lucky, a street dog from Bangkok who jumped into a taxi with her and never left. There are Sophie and Ben, geese who honk from morning to night. Boop and Pawn, the goats, are romantically involved. Hedgehog Dumpling enjoys belly rubs from time to time. The list goes on. Zhang raises her brood on her 8,000 square meter farm in Chiang Mai, a mountainous region in northern Thailand's Chiang Mai province. Zhang shared her journey from cryptocurrency marketing executive in Beijing to farm girl in Thailand on social media. She is especially popular on Xiaohongshu, a female-focused app similar to Instagram, where she has more than 38,000 followers. She said her story shows people that the transition to a slower pace of life is not some illusion or idealistic thing, but very real. Moving to Thailand allowed her to create a multiverse of herself where she could be a farmer, an influencer, a businesswoman, and a single childless woman, away from the pressures of Chinese society. Zhang is part of a growing trend of Chinese, especially millennials, who feel that the country that was supposed to be the powerhouse of the 21st century has little to offer them personally, socially, intellectually, and spiritually. In recent years, the economic downturn and lingering trauma caused by the isolation of China's draconian zero-COVID regime have pushed people who would otherwise have been seen as the country's success stories to emigrate. It was like the end of the world, says Linda Su of the lockdown in Shanghai. She was the general manager of a successful skateboarding startup in Shanghai until March 2022, but now spends most of her time in Chiang Mai figuring out what the next chapter could be. Chiang Mai, a tourist hotspot popular with hikers and nature lovers, has become an unexpected second home for thousands of new Chinese expats. More than 110,000 Chinese citizens applied for long-term visas to Thailand between January and September 2022, almost equal to the total number of citizens in 2019. Almost half of participants in Thailand's elite card visa scheme, which offers long-term residency rights for fees starting from 900,000 Thai baht, £19 per 100, are Chinese. Thousands of them are settling in Chiang Mai, drawn by the city's laid-back atmosphere and permissive society, with or without legalized marijuana. Cannabis has never been freely available in the People's Republic of China. But not so long ago, China's major cities abounded with independent bookstores, cinemas, and public spaces where like-minded people could meet openly to discuss topics such as feminism, LGBT issues, philosophy, and anything else that might interest them. Despite the fact that some topics have always been taboo, the country's intelligentsia moved along these red lines with relative ease. But after more than a decade of increasingly harsh rule by Xi Jinping, few, if any, of these spaces remain. As such, Nowhere Bookstore opened in Chiang Mai in November 2023, following the launch of its sister store in Taipei the previous year. Founded by Zhang Ziping, a mainland-born journalist now at Harvard University, the small space houses stories on topics that would be impossible to discuss openly in China, such as the 2020 protests and the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. There are a lot of books you can't see or buy in mainland China, says a young designer from Guangzhou who took the opportunity to visit the store while on holiday in Thailand, saying she would otherwise have to rely on scattered information, Chinese internet. In addition to selling books, Nowhere also hosts events in Chinese on a wide range of topics for the growing Chinese community in Chiang Mai. At a recent event, 62-year-old writer Zhang Ziping spoke about spending his retirement years in exile. Zhang began his career as a police officer in the 1980s, but quit after the Tiananmen Square massacre and became a famous poet and writer, working under the pseudonym Yi Fu. He arrived in Thailand in late 2019 after hearing from doctors in Wuhan, the capital of his home province of Hubei, about a virus that was spreading at an alarming rate in the city. Thailand is certainly not as safe as the US, Europe, or Japan, he says, acutely aware of the fate of Gui Minhai, a Swedish bookseller who was kidnapped from Thailand in 2015 and then reappeared in a Chinese prison months later. Scared dissidents in Thailand. But this is still a country with freedom of speech. At its core, it protects human rights. Zhang is part of an old clique of expats who have founded a retirement village in the outskirts of Chiang Mai where artists hang out. Unlike millennials, this older generation was formed during China's more liberal era of the 1980s and has a more political perspective on the country's development trajectory. We were a hopeful generation of people who made great sacrifices and efforts, but ultimately failed, Zhang says. Young Chinese today are in more desperate straits than we were then. In the next few years, they will be unemployed, their lives will be in crisis, and their human rights will gradually diminish. For Du Yinghong, an artist, one of the reasons he emigrated was because he believes that art is dead in his home country. It doesn't bring spiritual satisfaction, it doesn't bring material dissatisfaction, he says. In addition to Thailand's low cost of living, Du is drawn to the country's Buddhism. Thailand is believed to have the second largest number of Buddhists in the world after China, and as a percentage of the population, it is much more common in Thailand, where 90% of adults claim adherence to the faith, according to the Pew Research Center. Chinese Buddhism is Buddhism in quotation marks, says Du, 48. In China, there is no real Buddhism, no real Christianity, no real Islam. It's all fake. Of course, there are a lot of really pious people in China, good people, but what they do or what they believe happens in a certain political environment that doesn't allow you to have real faith. Many Chinese in Thailand say they are attracted to the idea of a less consumerist, more peaceful lifestyle based on Thailand's Buddhist principles. With the highest levels of inequality in East and Southeast Asia, Thailand's appeal may be due in large part to the fact that the low cost of living allows relatively wealthy Chinese to have a slower pace of life in Chiang Mai than they could afford in Chongqing. However, the space that Thailand offers for people seeking a more spiritual life is another attractive destination for Chinese who feel increasingly suffocated at home. Founded in 2010, Panyatin International School is a school built almost entirely from bamboo that offers education based on Buddhist principles known as bhavana. Staff participate in an annual silent meditation retreat, and students harvest their own rice harvest from a nearby rice field to learn about the efforts being made to feed the planet. More than 10% of students are from China, and although tuition fees reach 549,000 Thai baht £11, 900 per year, this is still only about a third of the cost of the best international schools in Beijing. Chinese parents are attracted to the fact that the school offers an international, diverse education for their children and is also rooted in Asian values, said Gloria Niu, a Chinese language teacher at Chiang Mai University, who sends her daughter to Panyatin. One of the school's 12 wise habits that teachers emphasize to children is to know the right amount, which is a reference to the idea of not consuming too much or too little. There is also a full-time spiritual director. This is an approach to education that is unimaginable in traditional, hyper-competitive Chinese schools. Shang says her parents feel like the money they spent on her education was flushed down the toilet. But living in Thailand is the only way I can do everything I want, she muses. In fact, without actively choosing it, I live this feminist lifestyle.